everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Kyle Buller, Michelle Janikian, and Benjamin Mudge. I'm really excited. Benjamin Mudge, about a year ago, was part of an article Michelle wrote for us on including bipolar folks in psychedelic research. And Benjamin, you're doing Ph.D. work around this topic. Is that right?
That's right. So I'm doing a Ph.D. in the psychiatry department at Flinders University, which is in Australia, though now I'm living in England. And I'm also the director of Bipolar Disorder CIC, which is a not-for-profit community interest company working for bipolar people's interests in developing new treatment protocols. And my background, I'm not actually a psychiatrist. So my background is a creative person and a political activist for all my life who has bipolar disorder. So I've experienced manic depression since I was a teenager. I was wrongly diagnosed at first and then diagnosed accurately when I was doing another PhD, actually in a women's studies department. And I was prescribed the wrong antidepressant and became manic psychotic, got locked in hospital, and went on a journey through the mainstream psychiatric system. Tried 17 different prescription pharmaceutical drugs and SSRIs, antipsychotics, lithium, and all sorts of stuff. They gave me some really bad side effects. So I left psychiatry, tried to figure out my own way, tried a bunch of herbs from herbalists and Chinese doctors. They didn't work. And then 15 years ago, I discovered ayahuasca. And I've been off psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs ever since then. And I was given a scholarship by Flinders University Psychiatry Department to do research into the therapeutic potential of ayahuasca for bipolar people in general. So I was the prototype test case, and now I'm researching. I've got 65 people in my study so far, and a bunch of theoretical and quantitative data as well.
That's outstanding. Yeah, it's really necessary. We'll get into this in more depth in just a moment. But I guess as this comes out, it'll be the day after our 5th birthday party. Just want to throw that out there to everybody that's listening. I'm really excited.
Feliz aniversario.
Yeah. And it's going to be great. And we still have spaces left in Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. And Benjamin just said he had a couple friends that gave it a thumbs up recently as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that. And yeah, that starts up on May 20. CEs are available. Reach out if you have any questions. Cool. I think that's enough for right now. So we haven't changed the name of Solidarity Fridays yet. We're thinking about it. If you have any suggestions, email us. support@psychedelicstoday.com. And yeah, we'll definitely consider what you have to share. Anything else we want to throw out before we dig in?
Well, I guess there's still some room for the mind mending series. It's a class on serotonergic psychedelics by Dr. Melanie Pincus. So that will be on Tuesday, May 18th. So it'll be a few days after this episode comes out. And you can check that out at psychedelicstoday.com. Go to events, and then you can find the link there.
Great. Very great. All right. Well, I think we're solid to jump in, unless Michelle.
No, I'm just excited to be here. It's been a whole year, like Joe said in the intro, since I wrote one of the only articles there is out there on bipolar and psychedelics. It's called Bipolar and Psychedelics, an investigation into the potential and risks. It came out on May 11th, 2020. I spent all of April last year researching and writing it, which was height of quarantine, and went down this rabbit hole of really interesting information because, and this is what I want to start, asking Benjamin, because there is an idea in the psychedelic research community that bipolar people should be, they shouldn't be included in the clinical research because it could be dangerous, and there is some truth to that. But so I wanted to pass it over to Benjamin and, So this is this is pretty controversial, right? To talk about psychedelics and bipolar, and maybe you could start off a little bit with, what the risks are for bipolar diagnosed people using psychedelics, and maybe talk about also what the risks are in not including them in the research.
Great, thanks. Yeah, just firstly, thank you so much, Michelle, for writing such an awesome article and making this progress and actually bringing. I've had a lot of bipolar people reach out to me as a result of that, and I've been giving them advice and stuff. And thanks very much, Kyle and Joe, for having me talk today. It's great. So there are some very real concerns, valid concerns, and real known issues, danger that has been recorded when bipolar people take psychedelics. There's no doubt about this. It is risky business, right? Now, the main risk is that the psychedelic substance will accelerate the bipolar brain into a state of mania or even psychotic mania, and that this could be then that bipolar person could be at great risk to themselves or to others. And usually when there's a manic episode, the consequence of that is that there's a depressive or even suicidal episode straight afterwards. So the higher you go, then the further down you crash. So that does happen, and I'm not denying that by any means. But I do want to put that into perspective of the actual numbers of recorded cases and the context of those cases, right? So the basically the contraindication status between bipolar and people and psychedelics started with the first wave of psychedelic research with LSD and mescaline. Now, those are, of all the psychedelics, really the most stimulating and the most likely to trigger manic episodes. So this was happening, and there's everyone has been to, many people who have been to Burning Man or one of these psychedelic festivals would have seen some person basically manic, having taken too much acid. Right? This does happen. Now, and then there are problems with taking psilocybin. Actually, even microdosing psilocybin for a sustained period of time can create a manic episode, induce a manic episode. And likewise with ayahuasca, I've certainly uncovered numerous cases of bipolar people going to an ayahuasca retreat center and basically being hospitalized afterwards as a result of a manic episode. Right. But it's not that those individual cases do not logically imply that all bipolar people should be excluded from all psychedelic trials all the time, right? So what's going on is those limited number of cases have been massively extrapolated in an illogical way to make sweeping generalizations, right? That's one thing that's going on. Another thing that's going on is that there's a lot of misunderstanding and sort of attribution of blame in an inappropriate way in the interpretation of some of these events, right? So, for example, in my research, there was an example written up in an academic article of a bipolar person being hospitalized with manic episode after going to an ayahuasca retreat. But then I actually read the details, and if you look at it and done some investigation, and actually the guy was perfectly fine for night 1 and night 2 of the ceremonies, but then by the 4th ceremony in a row in a week-long retreat, he had a manic episode on the 4th night. And this is 4 nights in a row or 5 nights in a row of sleep deprivation, which in itself is a trigger for manic episodes. And also that was a buildup of the MAOI content in the ayahuasca. So ayahuasca contains MAOIs and an SRI and DMT, right? But the MAOIs stay active. So there's like, they're active. They don't get broken down in the blood. So they're actually, people's monoamine oxidase inhibition is built up. So by the fourth ceremony, they're massively MAOI inhibited, and MAOIs are in themselves known to induce manic episodes. So that's one example. And other examples are like in the ayahuasca retreats is if someone then is taking ayahuasca one night, they might be fine, but the next morning or the next day they might have San Pedro and then go manic. So that's one example. Another example is someone who was fine on the ayahuasca on the Saturday night, and on the Sunday morning he took some magic mushrooms as well, again with the MAOIs present in the blood. And as you probably know, MAOIs amplify psilocybin. So then he had a manic episode, and the police and the doctors blame it on the ayahuasca ceremony, implying it's the ayahuasca's fault. But that does not logically imply that it's impossible to make an ayahuasca ceremony that would work for bipolar people, right? So, likewise, you cannot extrapolate from psilocybin you can't extrapolate from LSD and mescaline down to DMT, because DMT has a much shorter duration of receptor binding time. Yeah. So in other words, the DMT molecule plugs into the 5-HT2A receptor for a much shorter duration time, approximately 15 minutes, compared to LSD, which is about 10 hours, right? So my theory, and I haven't proven this, but it is something that I've had some professors of neurobiology say that this makes sense, is that it's the duration of binding time that is actually creating the manic episode rather than the actual intensity of the psychedelics experience. And, so I have examples of people that I've interviewed who are bipolar, and they've just had DMT on its own without any MAOIs, and they've been totally fine. So those are some examples where things could be made to work, right? We could engineer the problem. Yeah. Another example is ketamine, for example, which acts on totally different receptors than 5-HT2A. And ketamine actually has been demonstrated to be very effective antidepressant for bipolar people in a depressed phase. So what I'm saying is that this generalization, this sweeping extrapolation from some limited evidence to just blanket contraindicate all bipolar people, it's just illogical. And furthermore, it's dangerous, right? So the reason it's dangerous is because bipolar people are massively suicidal, like about 20 times more likely than the general population to commit suicide, right? And also, even if they're not committing suicide, having a hell of a time most of the time anyway. Now, the idea of contraindication is based in the Hippocratic Oath of like do no harm. So all doctors and scientists are bound to do no harm. But what I'm saying is that doing nothing, i.e. just saying to bipolar people, no, you cannot join our study, you cannot have therapy, that's doing nothing. And it's kind of like hands off, avoiding responsibility. And, just as an aside, it's understandable that some scientists in the early days of doing psychedelic research would just want to simplify their studies, right? Where they're trying to limit the number of variables, right? So they don't, statistically they're trying to get an even sample set, and they're trying to design an experiment that will come up with concrete results of yes or no. And if you've got bipolar people in there, then it's just confusing the data set in an enormous way, right? So it's understandable that to exclude those for like scientific study design purposes. But what's happened is everyone's then assumed that that because they were excluded in these early studies, that it's just, the experts say you can't do it. And so what's gone around in the culture of the psychedelic research community and the psychedelic, the more recreational psychedelic use community, is that there's this contraindication status. And that, as I say, it's working. The contraindication status is not logical, and it's functioning more like a cultural taboo in our community than it is an evidence-based medical fact, right? And by the contraindication and the exclusion of bipolar people from the clinical trials, from the ayahuasca retreat centers and so on, that is an attempt to do no harm. But doing nothing when you've got a suicidal population does not equal no harm. Doing nothing is leading to two problems. One of the problems is we just kill ourselves because we've given up hope and we don't feel like psychedelics is giving us a reason to be hopeful. Like so many people, war veterans, right, rape victims and so on, with incurable, treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, at least they've got something to be hopeful for because thanks to MAPS and so on, MDMA is on the way, yeah? But bipolar people are like the message that we're getting from the psychedelic research establishment is we're just going to ignore you. And that's a really dangerous thing to say to a suicidal person. And then the other consequence of the exclusion is that the bipolar people are doing it anyway in a messy way. And it's kind of like a backyard abortion situation. Just some of these things just have to happen. Then, I know a lot of bipolar people who have just simply lied on the
yes,
on the intake forms, and they just lied and said, refused to admit that they'd got a bipolar diagnosis, and then they go into the wrong kind of ceremony, and something bad goes wrong, or they end up with some really dodgy character, some facilitator who's abusive towards them, and there's a lot of horror stories of that sort of thing going on. So do you see what I'm saying? Doing nothing does not equal doing no harm.
No, thank you so much for, explaining that for our audience. And you bring up so many interesting points and a lot of things that I also found in my research writing this article, because I did a survey as well, and about 60 people diagnosed with bipolar filled it out and told me about their psychedelic experiences, and they are taking them anyway, right? And sometimes they're getting a lot of help, a lot of insight, maybe not like a lot of insight into their own behavior, into their moods, into their manic and depressive states, and through that insight, gaining more control over their lives. And it was really interesting. But you're right, they need their own protocol, right? Maybe bipolar people shouldn't be using psychedelics as often. If they went to an ayahuasca ceremony retreat, maybe just the one night ceremony would be enough, things like that. So I would love for you to explain a little bit about the protocol you're working on and things you're learning in that regard.
Okay. So what I would really like to see, and what I will be as soon as I finish my PhD, I'm going to write a manual for how to facilitate an ayahuasca ceremony for bipolar people. It would be based on all my PhD research and based on my own personal experience of 15 years of drinking ayahuasca in many, many, many different sets and settings. Also, I've been training to be an ayahuasca ceremony facilitator myself with the aim of one day, having a retreat center or a church or something for bipolar people. And so the manual would basically spell out, it would be an instruction manual, yeah? And some of the things you could understand. So there's a specific brewing technique for ayahuasca that works better than the others. And so I just need to put this in context, right? So psilocybin, magic mushrooms are easy. They just got one, as far as you know, one psychoactive ingredient in them, right? Ayahuasca's got, there might be debatable, but basically we're talking about one, right?
Yeah.
Ayahuasca, we know, has got at least 4. So you got the DMT, which is a 5-HT2A receptor agonist. Then you got 2 monoamine oxidase inhibitors, harmine and harmaline. And then you've got tetrahydroharmine, which is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, there are different types of ayahuasca vine, and the indigenous, have different names for them. They're commonly called the red vine, the white vine, the yellow vine, the oregano vine, the black vine. And they have different amounts of the harmala alkaloids in them, right? And then you've also got ratios where, how much vine compared to how much leaf do you put in the cooking pot, and then how hot is the pot and how the cooking temperature and the cooking duration and stuff like this. So this, whatever each individual pot has a specific technique, brewing technique, and that ends up with a different ratio of these 4 psychoactive ingredients. And what I've figured out is that the ratio of ingredients, the balance of that ratio affects the balance of brain chemistry in a bipolar person. And so some of the brews are a lot more stimulating, and some of them are a lot more sedating, and some are balancing, basically. So what I'm trying to do is figure out the balance in these. And by the way, since I've got some really, really exciting news, Michelle, since the last time I spoke to you,
tell me.
I have found a lab that's doing the chromatography work for me. So
sweet.
I've been going to ayahuasca ceremonies, taking notes of what happens to me. I'm my own guinea pig, and then I take a little bit home, put it in my freezer. I've got 82 different little containers of ayahuasca in my freezer.
I'm just picturing this freezer, sorry.
Yeah. There's no room for anything else. Then, anyways, for 5 years, I've been trying to find a laboratory who will do chromatography for me. Now, even if I'm willing to pay them a handsome fee for doing this, they say no, and the reason why is because in order for the chromatography machine, it's called HPLC machine, to work properly, you have to calibrate it with some pure reference sample DMT, and pure DMT is definitely an illegal Class A substance. Ayahuasca is gray area, but pure DMT needs a Class A license. And so most of the labs haven't got that, and the ones that do, it's just been incredibly complicated. It's just been impossible. But finally found a lab, and they're in the lab being analyzed right now, and I'm really excited about it.
That's
got
really
50
exciting.
Samples, and from that I'm going to draw a bunch of graphs about these ratios and figure out, what is the best one, and what's the best technique, and how does that correlate at a molecular level to what's going on, which has a lot of implications that we'll get onto a bit later on in terms of pharmaceutical and stuff like that. So I've got a brewing technique for ayahuasca that basically is balancing for bipolar people. And then there's certain settings. So I think it makes a lot more sense to do for bipolar people to drink ayahuasca during the daytime, be finished by like 6 or 7 p.m. and have a meal and go to bed by 11 p.m. and have a normal sleep and do not mess with the circadian rhythm, because the circadian rhythm destabilization is the trigger for manic episodes, right? So that's one thing. And then there's other things like what I've noticed from all the interviews, I've noticed that when bipolar people are drinking fermented ayahuasca that's fermented over time and becomes alcoholic, that the alcohol content, even though it's a teeny bit, changes the chemistry of the ayahuasca and can trigger manic episodes, or it actually triggers depressive episodes, actually. And then there's things like, well, what incense do you use? So it's pretty universally, if you look across the cultures, using some kind of incense in the ceremony for smudging people is really important for spiritual and energetic and emotional clearance reasons. But using frankincense or using tobacco or using agua de Florida, which has alcohol in it, is all problematic. So then I would say, use either Palo Santo or use Sapa, which is what the Yahuanawa use, for example, or Copal or something like that, right? So, and that is because, believe it or not, frankincense is psychoactive, right? And, so basically the point is to not add any other psychoactive substances in the mix. It's just pure ayahuasca. That's the only thing that they're taking. So no hape, no mapacho tobacco. So the Shipibo lineage say to me, we can't run an ayahuasca ceremony with no mapacho tobacco. And it may well be that the Shipibo model doesn't work. And it may well be that the Temple of the Way of Light will not be able to do this. But maybe we can figure it out. Or what's more likely, we need to set up our own prototype retreat center or church that could do this according to this protocol. And by the way, what I've written the kind of it's on your website, actually, the Psychedelics Today website. There's my list of do's and don'ts. I'm not recommending that any bipolar people do take ayahuasca. But I know, and I have compassion for the fact that a lot of them are suicidal and they're desperate and they're just going to do it anyway to just try, because nothing else is working for them. So they're going to try and they're going to lie to get in. And what I'm saying is, if you're going to do that, then at least do not make the same mistakes that I've identified other people making. So I've given a list of things of avoid this, and this, and do it in this way if you're going to do it for your own reasons. And what's been interesting is that one guy wrote to me, he said, man, I read that list and I thought, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And then he went down to Peru and then he had a manic episode. And he came back and he wrote to me, he said, I wish I'd listened to your list, paid attention to what you were saying. And then a few other people have taken that and have got back to me and said, well, I've just been to ayahuasca ceremonies and I followed your instructions and they went really well. So this came through your article, Michelle, that someone said that. So this is really cool.
Nice job.
I'm not saying it, and I point out that it is risky. So even if people follow my kind of do's and don'ts, you still have absolutely no idea what the ratio is in the particular bottle of ayahuasca tea that you're served on that night. So it may well be destabilizing and it is therefore dangerous. So the protocol basically is a specific protocol tailor-made for bipolar brains is, I think, where we will get some really consistent positive results.
No, thank you. That's so interesting. really appreciate you explaining that. And it makes sense, I mean, on a logical level. And I do hope that the research can, prove that, right? Once we are able to get all those 81 samples tested. I'm so excited for that. I guess this kind of leads us into, let's talk about what's happened since that article came out, right? I know that I've had some researchers reach out to me, as well as folks, diagnosed with bipolar who are looking for guidance. And I guess I wonder, has what's happened in your world in the last year? Any new connections, progress, things like that have happened as a result of getting the word out?
Yeah, I've got a big queue of people. I've got over 100 people who are flagged in my inbox who are bipolar, and they got the same sort of story, the medications I've been prescribed don't work for me, and I'm desperate, I'm suicidal, I need to try something else. Can you either give me some of your ayahuasca, or can you send me to a retreat center or whatever? And I'm honored to be asked this, but I'm in an incredibly difficult situation where, number one, I can't give advice through my university, or else I'll get kicked out of my department. Number two, I just don't really have the capacity to answer 100 people. I'm just struggling. I've run out of funding for my PhD, and I'm just struggling to get that finished. And then also, it's actually really heavy, to be honest. So
I know.
What's happened was several people have reached out to me, and I've tried my best to help them, in one way or another. And some of them are personal friends of mine. And, I have a lot of bipolar friends, statistically speaking. And the really heavy thing is that 4 of my personal friends, plus 2 other people who reached out to me, I wouldn't call them personal friends, but I was in contact with during the course of this PhD. And I had to say to all of them, I'm sorry, but according to the ethics committee, I am not allowed to give you any of the medicine that I have in my fridge, even though I'm certain it would, or almost certain it would help you. So it's been deemed by the experts in academia and in science to be unethical for me to do that. Now, these people have committed suicide. And this has been really upsetting for me, obviously, triggered my own manic depressive mood swings, and really made me question the whole concept of ethics as defined by an institutional committee of experts, as opposed to peer ethics that's based in compassion when, excuse me, but can anyone actually give me a logical reason why one peer of one minority group who has total or very or superior understanding than the rest of the population about what this other bipolar person's going through, knows how to help them, and actually has some experimental treatment medicine? Can anyone actually give me a logical, ethical reason why those bipolar people can't get together and help each other out? And, and also, who has the right to decide what, risks they take? And, this is a whole cognitive liberty thing. I know you're onto this. I know all 3 of you are all onto this case of we should be able to dose ourselves with our own psychedelics. Thank you very much. Right now, surely that applies to bipolar people. Now, I'm bipolar, so I'll talk in terms of subjective experience, right? So why can I not have access to a experimental medical treatment when I know, when I've done the research and I've given informed consent that it may induce a manic episode, but then again, it may get me out of a suicidal episode and prevent me killing myself. So prevent a death by getting me out of suicidal ideation, and maybe there's a risk of a manic episode as a consequence. So the greater risk thing it's doing nothing is a greater risk, and denial and contraindication and exclusion and prohibition from access to these things it's dangerous, seriously dangerous.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
Sure, Joe and I could go on about this topic of ethics. we were trying to write a whole thing on it. Well, I guess we did contribute to it. But I mean, we were actually having this conversation, yesterday, 2 days ago, about like kind of different types of ethics. And like what we were exploring was the difference between like these virtue-based ethics of like Aristotelian ethics versus, what was the other one? I'll just say like institutional ethics, more professionally based ethics of like, say, the scientific field or like the counseling profession, ethics within an institution. But our teacher, Lenny, was always coming back to kind of like that virtue-based ethics of what's good for the polis, talking about community politics, and what is good for like the community. How do we find the balance between what's good for the government, the community, and the individuals? And it seems like with some of the institutional ethics, it's only what's good for the institution because there's liability there. Oh, right? Like what happens if, somebody engages in this work, then the liability is on us, so we'll just exclude that. Versus saying, well, here's an actual problem that we need to face, and how do we find a balance between the two? And I think, most of the ethics that we engage in seems more kind of institutional based or professional based, and we put up these barriers instead of maybe actually thinking what's good for the whole at times.
It's really crazy. Yeah. Like I have some serious problems with the way people think about ethics currently. Thankfully, I have no license or no attachment to a university, so I can run my mouth like crazy. For those who can't. And it's like, we can be saving lives and we aren't because of ethics. And it blows my mind. This is a huge thing in the drug war. We know how to save a gazillion lives, but it's not ethical to end the drug war yet. According to who? So we'll figure it out eventually. And your video, Benjamin, that you sent over is extraordinary. I think you lay out your case so well that I can't really see a chink in the armor to attack that argument. That said, I'm not a chair of a department at a university. I'm sure they would, they're great with argumentation, right? So maybe they could. I don't know. Have you had any pushback from establishment figures on this argument or talk track?
That video, it hasn't really gone out. I haven't pushed it yet. I'm trying to get through the backlog of the bipolar people who've asked for my help already before I put out that video, which I know is going to get a lot more attention.
Okay.
But
And for folks listening,
video,
I just wanted to say the video is from the Psychedelics Madness and Awakening conference, and it's called Including Bipolar People in Psychedelic Research. Sorry to interrupt you, Benjamin. Just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, great. And I just want to give the context to that. So what happened was there's the bipolar people, but there's also the schizophrenic people, right? Mm-hmm. Or people who experience auditory, hearing voices, basically.
Yeah.
So the hearing voices community and stuff like that. Now, we're both excluded from psychedelic research, right? So what happened was a bunch of people who themselves were excluded, and some of our allies got together and put on their own conference called Psychedelics, Madness and Awakenings, right? So it's hilarious. And I'm kind of like, there was a moment where I was thinking, is it possible for a bunch of people who've experienced mania and psychosis to put on a conference and get it together? And they did a really professional job. And so, and they did it with no funding and all the rest of it. So there's a bunch of videos on that Psychedelics, Madness and Awakenings conference website addressing, I'm basically the only, well, there's two bipolar people. I'm, as I can go on and on about this for ages. So I've said a lot on there, and there's one other person, but there's lots of people with experience of psychosis and schizophrenia talking as well. So it's really interesting. And everyone's saying the same thing. It's like, no one has the right to tell us that we cannot trial a life-saving medicine.
Yeah. And by excluding folks, I mean, not only is that dangerous because people could hurt themselves and other things, but it also contributes to the stigma, right, against people with these diagnoses. And then they're like, in the public eye or in the eye of mainstream psychiatry, it's like they're treated as less than human, I feel like. Mm-hmm. And it's quite patronizing. And I think it just does come back to cognitive liberty and giving folks their own agency, right? And isn't that what psychedelics end up teaching so much of us when we take them for healing and growth, that really like the power is within us to make all the changes and do all the things. And we have to do it. and I think that that's extended to folks with other types of, mental health conditions, that they can like that's what I saw in my survey, is that people really saw their own agency in their own illness. And it was such a beautiful and awakening thing for them. And I don't know. Yeah, I also really struggle with this issue because it just doesn't treat these folks like equals when we put it in these terms. And that's not right to me.
That's right. And unfortunately, the psychedelic experts have taken on this patronizing attitude from the psychiatrists. So that's what I find. So, generally speaking, I'm not giving psychedelic researchers a hard time, because I think, to be honest, to be fair, while we were dealing with the aftermath of prohibition from the 70s, right? And we're trying to trying to establish some credibility and establish some actual publications of solid research done properly with solid data, and to get the funding to do that, and, to work against the stigma, that actually it was appropriate to exclude bipolar people for, the last decade or so. But now it's like psychedelics have got tenure, right? We are now, our community is firmly established in the mainstream. It's firmly established at big, posh universities. And it's time to stop being so guarded about that position, which was 10 years ago fragile. It's not anymore. Yeah. It's time to actually be braver and be more heart open to the people like the bipolar people and the schizophrenic people who are excluded. Yeah. Now, the other thing is that, has anyone actually weighed up the side effects and the potential dangers and ramifications of mainstream psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs, right? So, speaking from my personal experience, and this is still a phenomenon that's very, very, very widespread, is when a bipolar person goes into a doctor for the first time and they say, I'm depressed, it's still, decades and decades after the understanding, the shared understanding of the difference between unipolar depression and bipolar disorder, right? The doctors and the psychiatrists en masse still do not even bother to ask enough questions to make that distinction. And really, it's not rocket science. It's pretty straightforward. I can figure it out within an hour of talking to someone, right? And what's happening is they're just going, oh, you're depressed, here's some antidepressants. So they give them usually the so-called SSRIs. Now, I just want to point out, by the way, SSRI is a marketing term that was invented by the big pharma when this new generation of Prozac and Prozac and Seroxat and citalopram and drugs like that came out, so that there's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Well, they're not really that selective. So what happens is in the first about 2 or 3 weeks after taking something like Prozac, for a lot of people, before their serotonin levels have risen, which is usually a pretty good way to help with depression, before that happens, there's this big spike in dopamine. So they're not selective. They're actually targeting dopamine at the beginning before they target serotonin. Now, what that does is if someone's suicidal, but they haven't got the motivation to actually kill themselves, then the dopamine spike gives them the motivation to act on the suicidal ideation. And there have been, since the 80s and the Prozac and citalopram and Seroxat came out, there have been approximately 1 death by either suicide or murder from people taking so-called SSRI drugs, right? So that's, to me, that's what I call a pretty serious side effect, right? And that's in common now with bipolar people. Those pills, so-called SSRIs and the SNRIs, like venlafaxine, which is serotonergic and noradrenergic, trigger mania in a very large proportion of the bipolar population. So this is what's going on. And that's a really big risk. So it's so common. It happened to me. I gave up my resistance to psychiatry, and eventually I tried an antidepressant, paroxetine, Seroxat, it's marketed as in the US, when I was doing my first PhD. And then I became manic, and then I went back to my doctor, and the doctor said, well, GlaxoSmithKline is a very reputable company, and it says on here, it's good for all the symptoms. And, this love, he was totally charmed by the marketing woman that came to give him the sample pills. And he said, I think you should double the dose and come back in a month. And I doubled the dose, and then I went into like a serious full-blown manic with psychotic features episode. Really was a danger to myself, and I got locked up, right? And then once that happened, then I was locked up, lost my PhD position, and then I was literally injected with antipsychotics and so on and so on. And so the damage was done, and then I'm in that system, and I'm getting medicated. I was given over the next 6 years, I was given 17 different pharmaceutical drugs, right? You think that's bad? One of my friends, she's had 65 psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs plus 50 electroconvulsive brain electric shock treatments, right?
Jeez.
That's her history. And you know what? She's getting great results from ayahuasca now.
To me, just hearing this, though, is just so shocking that we can have so much stigma against psychedelics for bipolar people when the mainstream options are just as dangerous, right? Like, I just can't. It doesn't make any logical sense to me.
No. And we haven't even started talking about the more sort of subtle things, which are the numbing of emotions, the dumbing of intellect, the dampening of libido, and the disconnection from spirit, right? So these are the things that are the most important for your average bipolar personality, And, there is, and this is before, creativity as well, right? So creative people are 19 times more likely to be bipolar than the general population. And for us creative people, the creative spark is the most important thing. Now, I used to be an oil painter, and everyone thought I'd be a professional artist. That is in that corner there. That's the last ever artwork that I did. Then I was put on antipsychotics aged 20 or 21, something like that. And I got painter's block. So I've not been able, art department of my brain just got shut down permanently. I haven't been able to do a painting ever since, right? That's my example. But there's a lot of examples of, bipolar people just complaining bitterly about being numbed out, being zombified. And that might not show up on the statistics charts of the psychiatrists, like the checklist, because the psychiatrist, like as far as the government's concerned, right? If a bipolar person is not going bankrupt by blowing their credit card and is not, crashing cars and locked in hospital for being manic, then that's a good result. And whether, fair enough, but if that's done at the expense of ruining the most precious thing in their life and their creative abilities, is it worth it? So psychedelics, as we all know, enhance creativity. Now, psychedelics, if we could figure out a way to engineer psychedelics to work for bipolar people, that would be amazing for the bipolar population. And then it would have ramifications for the general population as well, because, what if, as I put it, like, Amy Winehouse, for example, Amy Winehouse, bipolar person, was, when she says, I don't want to go to rehab, at that time, there was an underground ayahuasca community thriving in London. She hadn't heard about it. If instead of she gone to rehab, if she'd found that community, maybe she'd have been alive. And what about the Heath Ledgers and the Kurt Cobains and the Jimi Hendrixes of this world and so on? These people impact the whole world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a really great conversation, an important conversation. And I guess it just makes me like, the one thing that's like really kind of firing my head is like, why haven't we, I guess, like the research community started to explore like these options? When I think about like maybe some of the past research, like say we look at like what happened in the 60s, like Stan Grof, I mean, he was treating people with like schizophrenia. I think about the container ship, right? Like they're working within a hospital setting. Those people were probably in there for a bit, weren't going anywhere. But, and I could see probably why the new psychedelic, research doesn't include people with bipolar and whatnot. Maybe because of the harm that can be done with the container that they're really providing. But it really makes me question, like, why can't we create a container and a protocol like you're exploring for the safety of everybody, right? Because people are doing it. I think that's like a harm reduction approach and a population that really needs healing and alternative like modalities and treatment options, right? A population that's really suffering. And I think they deserve it, right?
Now, there will be some research coming, right? I know after this article that I wrote came out a year ago, I had some researchers at the San Francisco Band Lab reach out to me to ask me about my research, and I shared some of my data, like my survey responses, totally anonymous, by the way, if you're listening and filled that out. I didn't include anyone's names or anything, but just, including people's experiences. So this group of researchers could develop a study. And so I do think that it's still going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen for a year or two, but they are going to explore psilocybin for bipolar 2 depression, very specifically, but to see if psilocybin in the clinical context could help folks with bipolar 2, rise out of their depressive state. And I do know that they spoke to you as well, because I connected them with you, Benjamin.
That's right.
And do you have any more about that, or any other research that might be happening in the near future around this topic?
Well, yeah, they spoke to me at length, and I gave them some advice, and they took it on, and I was really impressed that, they just took this perspective. I'm so impressed with this UCSF Band Lab, and I'm so impressed that they've brave enough to do this. So it's the first ever clinical trial where they're deliberately including bipolar people. Now, they're doing it in the safest imaginable way with ketamine. With psilocybin. So, there's the bipolar mood swing, and they're getting people at the rock bottom of that swing. So in their depressive phase, and then they're giving them psilocybin at that time, and only at that time, and they're only giving them a low dose. So they're giving them a significantly lower dose than what the people with unipolar depression are being given at Imperial or at Johns Hopkins.
Interesting,
for example,
yeah.
right? And, the rationale is, well, let's not mess them out, and let's not create a mess, and let's see if we can get a good result with a low dose and go from there. But they're open-minded to moving forward, right? Now, and blessings to them. There is some other published data. There's 2 other bits of published data which include bipolar people in a clinical trial with a psychedelic, kind of by accident, right? So it wasn't deliberately focusing on that. So MAPS, in their MDMA trials, using the whole Mithofer, male-female protocol, that thing, they included people with bipolar disorder type 2. Now, if you don't know, I'll just clarify. Type 1, this is since the DSM-5, since DSM-4, they've distinguished between type 1 and type 2 bipolar. Type 2 is people that have only had what's called a hypomanic episode. They haven't gone full-blown into mania, and most of the time they're depressed, right? Type 1 is really depressed and then really manic as well. Now, I will point out that all the criterion, all the categories in the DSM manuals are theoretical frameworks that were from the psychiatrist's mind trying to map out the reality of human experience and to categorize them. They're not rock solid categories by any means. And really everything to do with bipolar disorder is a continuum. Yeah. Mm. Anyway, but it is a useful concept. And bipolar type 1 were excluded from the MDMA trial, but bipolar type 2 were included. And when they were included, none of them went manic. So this was a good start. Yeah. Now, then there's some other trials that happened in Toronto with ketamine for mainly for major depression, but they decided to include some bipolar people as well. And again, kind of by accident, but it worked for them, got rid of the depression and did not create a manic episode. And there is a lot of, it's not all called underground, but it's like, because you can, doctors and psychiatrists can give ketamine to patients because it's a licensed drug. It's already FDA approved. They're doing it, and it's happening, and they're giving it to bipolar people, and it's working out well for them, getting rid of the suicidal ideation, and that's great. But I would say, why isn't anyone talking about this in a wide way? And why can't we use that to like break the this generalization of bipolar being contraindicated with psychedelics? Yeah. So those are the only clinical trials that are either happening or about to happen. However, to be fair, there are some really progressive people from MAPS who I've spoken to, senior staff at MAPS, who said, we would really love to do some work with bipolar disorder. And, I have got a lot of very senior academics, researchers, and clinicians in the psychedelics field say, well, this is really a great idea that you're doing. But, no one's really bitten the bullet and put their name to what I'm doing, or actually said, okay, let's get to work, or here's some funding, or anything like that, right? There's still what I'm calling a cultural taboo in amongst the community. It's just like, does not compute. We just can't really, this is it's a little bit too uncomfortable for us, and we just, no comment. That's the approach, that's the response that I get in general.
Yeah. I guess I have a question, and might be personal too, but I guess kind of piggyback about that taboo. Like, how has your relationship changed to your bipolar? And how is like ayahuasca and psychedelics, I guess, like, has it shifted the way that you look at that disorder? you're kind of talking about the DSM, these are kind of like, a cluster of symptoms, the way the DSM describes disorders. And I wonder, how has it changed over the years for you and your relationship to it?
Fantastic question. Thank you. So, okay, I was what's called a compliant patient in the mainstream psychiatry. So I admitted that I had a problem and I wanted to fix it, and I was willing to take the pills that the experts were giving me. And it was only after I'd done this 17 times and my hair had fallen out and and I had all sorts of other massive problems that I quit. And then, but still, there was a lot of things about being bipolar that I was not self-aware about. Now, psychedelics in general, you can generalize about all sorts of psychedelics, that they give us a conscious and awareness of ourselves from a place that is outside of our ego. And we can see ourselves, in the case of ayahuasca, from the madre, the caring mother's perspective, who will kind of, tell us off if we're out of order, but it's still compassionate. And it's something that is impossible to see from within the ego or within default mode network, right? Now, that's been really good for me. The ayahuasca is the one that's worked for me, right? I go really seriously manic on LSD. I go really seriously manic on mescaline. I go on psilocybin. I go exuberant into borderline manic in a really funny way. MDMA, I feel absolutely incredible, and then I feel terrible afterwards. Ketamine, I've only just tried that once recently, and it kicked me out of a depression, and I was a little bit manic, but I could see how that could work. Ayahuasca, as I say, the way I brew it is the one that's balanced, and then I can have it's balanced in terms of the manic depression, and then I have all the psychedelic benefits within it in a balanced context. Now, what has it done to answer your question? Number one, it's given me an awareness of when I'm escalating into mania, right? So, like, usually a bipolar person does not become aware that they're manic until it's too late.
Yeah.
Until their husband and wife has left them, they're bankrupt, they've crashed their car, and the police, the psychiatrists and police are knocking on their door trying to arrest them, right? It's taken to the hospital. There's something about self-denial in that manic episode. Now, I am much more able to spot it coming on. Yeah, I'll catch it. It'll come on, and I'll catch it very quickly, and then I'll go. Then I also have an awareness, a much bigger social conscience. Yeah. So an awareness of how my behavior affects other people, like the hell that I've put my mother through when I've been manic and when I've been suicidal, for that matter. It's torture for my mother, right? And, it's torture for some of my close friends as well. So I'm like, well, I'm starting to go manic. Well, I could ride this out and get higher and higher, and it could be a lot of fun, and I could but I know what it really means. I know the damage it does to myself, and more probably I've got this, this heightened, you know what I mean? The ayahuasca helps you with like social conscience, right? I know the damage it does to other people. So I'm like, okay, I've got to stop doing the things that are escalating me, and I've got to go home and try to get some sleep and slow down. So there's that. And then the suicide thing, I'm really lucky. I have an incredibly stubborn lust for life and strong, stubborn resistance to suicide that has kept me alive. But I still, to be honest, suddenly have a lot of like really self-destructive behaviors, which are like a subtle, like suicide can't get me, but it's just going to mess me up a bit anyway. And I become more aware of these self-destructive behaviors and being able to compassionately and proactively and constructively do the practical things and have the compassionate state to lift myself out of those. So the self-awareness is absolutely key to the whole thing. Now, that is ironically the opposite of what the mainstream pharmaceutical drugs do. So I like a term that I like to use, which is like the opposite of psychedelic drug, is a stoicistic drug. So drugs that induce a stoic consciousness where one's emotions are like repressed and locked down. And pretty much all the pharmaceutical drugs that are available for bipolar people are stoicistic in that they may put on a plastic smile, but they numb you out to trauma, right? And the reasons why we got depressed in the first place, right? And there is statistically a big. I mean, it's there's still a sexual abuse epidemic in the world, particularly affecting women, and there's a big statistical correlation with bipolar people, and that's a big trauma that we're carrying as a population. And the woman that I referred to, who'd been through 65 pharmaceutical pills and plus the electroconvulsive shock treatment, she's like, never in any of that did it address her childhood sexual abuse, right? That was healed by a Shipibo woman in an ayahuasca ceremony. Now that's deep. So there are, in summary, there are kinds of healing that happened that are like psychosocial healing that can happen with psychedelics that basically eliminate the underlying triggers, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah, and then just in terms of like, just I guess a lot of other things. So a lot of like secondary things, like ayahuasca is a teacher, psychedelics are teachers as well. So, I go to an ayahuasca ceremony, and ayahuasca says, well, you got to change your diet. And it says, you got to stop taking such and such a supplement. Because, by the way, a lot of things like sports supplements, things like caffeine, and there's a lot of things that are okay for your average person, but are destabilizing for bipolar brains. And so I had this whole series of like going to ayahuasca ceremonies. Ayahuasca shows me, okay, this is the effect that such and such a supplement or such and such a habit is having on you. You should stop. And then I've stopped. And then I've changed my diet, and I've got into, and it's sleeping habits and, all sorts of other lessons. Now, I'm going to put all those in a manual as well, put them on my website and stuff. But these are the teachings that I've got from the ayahuasca that have been secondary, more subtle benefits for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that.
This reminds me a little bit of this, what you were saying previously. Kyle, you mentioned this quite often. Not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And Matt Ball has talked about this a bunch too. And it's kind of what I'm hearing. It's like, perhaps talk therapy is really important. Perhaps psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is really important. And maybe we need some meds in the mix, but, perhaps maybe after 5 pills don't work, we try other options. ECT is increasingly becoming less barbaric, but it's still a horrifying intervention. It's not something I think people sign up for and they're excited about it, right?
I think.
No, they do it because they're desperate.
Yeah.
Right. I want to disclose that I have a really close family friend, essentially a really close uncle, who kind of went through this, and he was very psychedelically active in his 20s, and I wouldn't be surprised if in his manic phases he does that as well these days. And it's put him in, he has no container. The family doesn't really hold this very well, and stuff like holding up in a hotel, like casino hotel, and racking up like crazy credit card debts and like the wild fantasies. It's incredible. And it's really sad because he's definitely one of the smartest people I know. And then watching him on the psychiatric meds they used to kind of sedate him it's horrifying. I met him once, and he was like a frail shell of himself, shaking, barely able to walk, not really able to communicate, hides from everybody that loves him. It's really, really a fucked up scene. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this topic. because I have personal experience with it from somebody I grew up with as like a really close role model. Yeah.
That's
So
deep.
just
Thanks
wanted
for
to share
sharing.
that.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't know
Can
that.
I give you a little insight? It's a
Obviously.
concept I call quantificationally challenged, right? So this is not in a textbook. I made this up, but I think it's true. Bipolar brains, right? We have an unstable circadian rhythm, and we have an unstable mood swings. So basically what's going on is like the processing speed in our brain, like the clock speed in the computer, processing speed in our brain is fluctuating faster and slower. And our perception of time is fluctuating faster and slower. And those things combine to make it very difficult to quantify anything. So to quantify time, to quantify amounts of money, quantify realistic optimism or pessimism, and how much we can put on our plate in terms of a project and stuff like that. So, so I swing between unrealistically overconfident and unrealistically pessimistic. And then I swing between, hyperactive to can't get out of bed. And I swing between, these, by the way, I'm a lot better now than I used to be, that's for sure. So this is like how I was. But I've seen it in general. So, and then when going manic, the confidence raises. And actually, to be honest, the intelligence raises as well, and the computational power raises, and the kind of synchronicities, synchronicities kind of fall in place. And you've probably noticed that, when you're in a psychedelic state, actually things just sync up, So with that combination of man, I can handle, I can beat this casino. It's really easy to get hooked into that. And it's not about being stupid. It's about having a disability to accurately quantify anything. And so, credit card debt is just so easy to go into. And that's another thing that I just went, okay, I ain't going to get any more credit cards. That's just how I handle it. I don't drink alcohol. I haven't drunk alcohol this millennium because I'm a nightmare on alcohol. These are the things that the ayahuasca told me. And she was right. But I say to that, so that unfortunately then your uncle and so many of us in the depressed phase that happens after the manic episode, when we feel really ashamed of ourselves and we've got the debt collectors knocking on our door and we've broken up with our spouse and so on and so on. Oh, the shame and self-loathing. And then the kind of the depression amplifies that in terms of rumination. It's deadly. It's really deadly. So I think saying this, giving that perspective of being quantificationally challenged could be a liberating thing. And, I personally think having a diagnosis is an empowering thing because it's like having a diagnosis of diabetes. It's like if you're getting diabetes and you're getting sick, you don't understand why, and then someone does a blood test and they tell you you're diabetic and this is what you need to do and you need to stop eating cake and so on, then it's not fun to find out. very challenging, but it could prevent, if that person then takes responsibility, it could prevent the diabetic person from getting a lot sicker and sicker and sicker. Then they have some agency and responsibility, and it's difficult. Who wants to stop eating cake, right? Nobody. It's difficult. Now, the bipolar person, when they get that diagnosis, it's difficult. It's a lot more difficult than stopping eating cake because you've got to do a lot of other stuff. But it should be just a shame-free, practical instruction manual that is empowering. Now, unfortunately, that at the moment comes with a contract with the psychiatric profession and the pharmaceutical industry. And in the small print, the psychiatrist says, here you go, here's your diagnosis. Sign below on the dotted line, and you are legally bound to take these toxic pills from the pharmaceutical industry for the rest of your life. And if you do not, then you can actually get like locked up.
Yeah.
There are people like there are, I know manic and schizophrenic people who are like, they have a choice between taking their pills and being observed to like put the pill in your mouth, swallow a glass of water, show me your mouth, have you swallowed it? That's choice number one. Choice number two is if they're not going to comply to that, they get injected with a 3-month-long slow-release antipsychotic pill. And these are the things, these are horrendous drugs, absolutely horrendous. What do they do to your spirituality, emotionality, intelligence, libido, creativity? They just ruin them. And they don't have a choice. So again, this comes back to like, please, psychedelic research community, can you actually look at this, what I'm calling a cultural taboo about the contraindication status, and actually think about it in the bigger picture. And by the way, one of the bigger pictures is making some money out of it, potentially. Put it out there. Like psychedelics need some funding. Well, the moment the US and UK, they spend approximately $1 billion per year attempting to treat bipolar disorder and failing dismally at doing so. Right. So there's a lot of budget there. And if that was 1% of that was redistributed into a psychedelic trial, then they could make a difference, for example. Yeah. So I don't know. Are there any holes in my argument?
No,
haven't seen one
sharing.
yet. Yeah. I was chatting with somebody last night, and they're like, if we think the military industrial complex is massive at $1 trillion a year, like the healthcare industry at $3 trillion could be even more massive and, intractable. So we've got to be aware and understand what we're up against, because there's a lot of money in these meds that people need to take daily. And, I'm not against meds, right? I'm against ignorance in medicine, and we need to be more deliberate, like let's critique things where we can healthfully and productively, and, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like this would be an incredible coup, Benjamin, if we're able to figure out a way to include, Shipibo or modified Shipibo ceremony into psychiatry. That would be a wild thing. I hope the planet can sustain it. I would expect Shipibos would be fine with this. I haven't really talked to too many, but assume you have.
I had a teacher
Kyle,
who did like shamanic work, who would he was always like the referral for the psychiatrists that didn't really know what to do with their clients anymore, and they would refer him over the clients and be like, and always surprised that some of that traditional healing seem to work at times. But always kind of surprised the traditional folks are like, oh, we don't know what to do. Maybe this might work. And, obviously being pretty surprised. Oh, okay. Maybe there's something there.
Yeah, this all keeps reminding me of another one of my sources for this same article that I interviewed Benjamin for, was an integration therapist who, wanted to remain anonymous. And, she was also diagnosed with bipolar and is using different psychedelic medicines, to increase her self-awareness. And it really, when Benjamin talked about like realizing when a mania was starting was something she talked about a lot to me. And it was really interesting. And her argument was like, yeah, there's a role for medication, like especially when I'm feeling like, oh, I think a manic episode is coming on, like, and she would, help herself sleep, sometimes with like Klonopin and other anti-anxiety meds. Now, this is not a recommendation for anyone, obviously, but I think one of the big hurdles for a bipolar person or a person who's diagnosed with bipolar, when you get the diagnosis, it's very much like, oh, well, now you have this lifelong brain disorder that's incurable and you have to take medication the rest of your life. And that's a really literally hard pill to swallow for a lot of folks. And I wonder if we've rethought this psychiatric approach to, of course, medication has its role, but maybe it's not a lifelong thing. Maybe it just helps, to stabilize folks 6 months, a year, and then, play it by ear, see what happens, see if there's other treatments, instead of it being this like, there's nothing else for you. Here's like, this really strong medication that, makes you shake and all these kinds of really kind of horrifying side effects forever. Like, of course, people are going to have suicidal ideation when they're saying this is the only way that you could possibly function in society. And so I just think there's a lot of room here to think about different treatment options. And of course, every individual is going to be different too, and to be open to really listening to that individual story rather than maybe focusing on, the diagnosis that they were given as the end all, like, explanation for everything. So I just really want to thank you before we start wrapping up, Benjamin, for all your work in this field. I think it's really helping people rethink a lot of things. I know it's helping me, and I'm really happy to be able to share this with more folks through this podcast and through the writing. And that's my last 2 cents, I think.
Fantastic. And I agree with you. There is a role for mainstream psychiatric pharmaceutical drugs. They can definitely play a role in stabilizing someone. And the question is, does that really have to go on for their whole life, or can they then, once they've got their life together and done some therapy, can they have a lower dose or have them less often or come off them or use a psychedelic or whatever? And that's not something that the profit margin and the big pharma wants to consider at this point. But I think the humans deserve it.
I agree. Thank you for that.
Thank you for being here. This is really, I hope, going to educate a lot of people about what is possible, some really helpful critiques, and make them aware of yourself, Benjamin. I think there's a lot more that's going to be coming from you as you progress with your PhD. And this dichotomy of ethics, like the university has kind of got our arm twisted, and we've got to follow certain sets of rules while we're working with the universities, and it's kind of just part of the package. And those folks are researchers, right? Not necessarily explicitly healers yet. That comes in time, and when the restrictions are dropped, hopefully. Again, thank you for being here with us. And Kyle, did you want to say anything as well?
No, I mean, I have lots of more questions, lots more comments, but I know we're way over time. So I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate your insights and perspectives here. And I'm excited to see how all your work unfolds. So thank you.
we'll have to keep this conversation open and going another time.
Yeah.
I also have like so many more things that I'd love to, get out there. But maybe we'll have to just do this again sometime.
Part 2.
Makes me want to run a conference on the topic.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Sorry.
We can do it.
Yeah. I'll see if I can line
More
that
work.
up. Yeah. I always want to add more to my plate for whatever reason. Never learn. Despite all the illness. And Benjamin, anything you want to say in closing? Any kind of websites you want to put out there?
Oh, yeah. So firstly, thanks to all three of you, and thanks to everyone that's been listening. There's a lot more I had to say that I wanted to raise. In particular, we were talking about, we were going to talk about, ethics in terms of investment, and can there be a psychedelic research corporation that's done in an ethical framework, how do you balance between for-profit and not-for-profit and all that sort of stuff. And then the whole issue of what's jokingly called pharmahuasca, as in, can you develop a pharmaceutical pill that is based on ayahuasca in the same way that psilocybin by Usona and so on is being based on magic mushrooms. And I have a lot to say about that. And so if you're up for it, I would so love to come back and talk about that, because there's so many, I've been thinking a lot about this. So yeah, I'd love to. Yes, a website that I'm plugging is bipolardisorder.me, www.bipolardisorder.me. That's my website. It's for the Bipolar Disorder not-for-profit community interest company. On there, there's videos that I've made about my research. There's some general information. There's all the projects that I've got underway, because I've got a project on lithium as well, and a project on a DIY diagnostic thing, so that bipolar people, or people who wonder whether they're bipolar, can go onto my website and get the diagnosis as an empowering bit of information, rather than going to a psychiatrist and maybe getting locked up in the process. So there's stuff like that. And if anyone wants to have a consultation with me, then I do these 2-hour Zoom calls where I give people a bunch of advice from my personal experience. I'm not medically qualified, but people say they're getting a lot of help from me. So that's a possibility. And of course, I would love some donations, because I've run out of funding to finish my PhD. You can hit me up with Bitcoin or any other kind of donation. I would love it.
How do people do that? On your website there?
Yeah, well, no, it's all on the website.
Sweet.
Cool. We'll make sure those are in the show links, show notes, so people can find them easily. Because, really important stuff. His website's really great. A lot of great graphs. I've spent a lot of time on it. Thank you again. I definitely think we should do a part 2 for folks that are interested in learning more. Keep an eye out for that. Visit bipolardisorder.me and check out the article I wrote a year ago. It's on the Psychedelics Today blog. We'll also put a link in the show notes.
Yep. Thank you, Rob and Mike, for that. And again, May 20th, we kick off our next round of Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. We got about 13 spaces left as of the 12th of May, and we'd love to have you. 2 different groups, so time zones work for Australia, UK, US, Canada, etc. So come on down. And Kyle, what can you tell us about the mind mending course?
Yeah, so this is a 1.5 hour course, hour presentation, half an hour Q&A with Dr. Melanie Pincus, exploring the neuroscience of serotonergic psychedelics, so the classical tryptamines, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, etc. You can check that out, psychedelicstoday.com, go to the events tab, and there should be a link there. And that will be on May 18th. It's a Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The first one of the series was on ketamine. She did a wonderful job. So really excited what she's putting together here for the serotonergic series here. So
All right. Well, I think we're good to wrap. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you, Benjamin Mudge, Michelle Janikian, Kyle Buller. And let's hang out for a minute, Benjamin. But we'll see everybody else later on.